I'm so glad you're here. This is Avery After Dark, and I'm your host, Avery Ross. I have a scary story for you today. It's strange, mysterious, truly bizarre, and real. This is a true story. Before we get into it, subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode. Are you ready? Let's get into the story. This is from beyond the grave. This story starts in Evergreen, Colorado. In 1995, David Thomas Chase, 42, and his wife Judy Amber Chase had just moved to Evergreen a year and a half prior. David Chase was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but he and Judy wanted a fresh start in a new place to call home. It was no question. The beauty and adventures of Colorado were going to be the perfect fit for the Chases. David himself was an avid outdoorsman, and the couple thought Evergreen would be a great place to start a new chapter of their lives. From all accounts, David and his wife Judy seemed to be a very in-love, closely connected couple. One extra notable addition to their life was at the time of this case, David and Judy were foster parents to two young children named Trisha and Darius. David and Judy loved the kids and were looking forward to adopting them in the near future. It can take quite a while to finalize adoption, but in the meantime, the Chases were building their life and family in Evergreen and were really looking forward to the future. David worked as a local craftsman and a cabinet maker, and he would also work other freelance jobs around town when they popped up. The day of June 6, 1995 started out like any other for the Chases. David was scheduled with a freelance job that morning and was going to work alongside a local handyman in Evergreen, a man named Matt Horosky, who lived just down the road from the Chases. Matt Horosky, 34, was going to work alongside David on a routine roofing job at a local Elks Club. So the two men were set to work that morning and then also later scheduled for some landscaping work. So that day, David and Matt reportedly finished the roofing job around noon and afterwards grabbed some lunch together. On the way home from that, they stopped at the bank as David had to deposit a check for $1,800. This check was an advance payment for an upcoming job, so David went to deposit the check, and then the two men decided to grab some drinks at a local bar before heading home. Now, Judy Chase, David's wife, knew he was working that day and was going to be spending the evening with Matt, and assumed her husband would be home later that evening. But as the hours rolled on, David never made it back home and didn't call either. This was highly unusual, so Judy immediately knew something was very wrong. Woman's intuition, wife intuition, she knew this was not like her husband to just disappear. David loved his home life, loved Judy, loved their young children. He never just didn't come home. And reminder, these were the days before people relied so much on cell phones. This is 1995, so when someone didn't make it home, you couldn't get on your phone and check their location, track them down. When you didn't know where someone was, you were just left wondering and worrying. And that's exactly what Judy Chase did all night. She sat in her rocking chair, worried sick, waiting for her husband to come walking through their front door. But he never did. When it hit morning, Judy quickly hopped in the car and drove straight over to Matt's house. She knew they were together last night. He would know where her husband is. Judy gets to his house and asks him about David. What happened last night? Where is he? Matt tells her that he doesn't know where David is. He said that he left him at the bar last night playing pool. And when he left, everything was fine. Matt said David was acting normally all night and was even in good spirits. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that wasn't the whole story. A few hours later, Matt's girlfriend calls Judy and tells her about something odd that Matt said when he got home the night before. According to Judy, when Matt returned home last night, his girlfriend asked about their night out. She said that when she asked Matt about David, he claimed that David, quote, had a raft and was going swimming in the river. The river he's referring to is Bear Creek River. It runs along the bar where the men were last seen that evening. So David went for a swim in an icy river? To Judy, alarm bells are ringing. Judy said this was completely bewildering. Quote, my husband was a very experienced mountain climber and studied hypothermia. So the story is absolutely, completely impossible for me to believe, end quote. This river near the bar was snow-covered at the time, freezing, and David knew the risks of swimming around in a snow-fed river in the middle of the night. Judy knew her husband wouldn't jump into an icy stream for no reason. None of this made any sense. The story was not plausible. She believed that Matt was hiding something. After this, Judy went to the police and reported her husband missing, telling them where her husband was the night before, who he was with, and the bizarre and unlikely story that Matt shared. One of the men on duty that day was Sergeant Brian Scott of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, and he immediately knew that he needed to speak with Matt. Matt immediately becomes a person of interest. So police question him and ask him about what happened that night. And Matt essentially tells police the exact same story as he told his girlfriend. He says that he and David spent most of the day drinking after their job was finished. A pitcher of beer at lunch, another beer at the Elks Club, and 2 more pitchers at the bars later that day. But Matt said after the last bar, the two actually unloaded some tree limbs from David's car and dropped them into Bear Creek River. Next, according to Matt, David allegedly decided to jump into the frigid cold river, telling Matt to pick him up in Morrison. He tells officers this was the last he ever saw of David, floating away down the river. So police share these new tidbits of information with Judy, and more alarm bells are going off for her. Another major red flag. See, Judy knew this wasn't true because her husband would never dump brush, tree limbs, any kind of lumber into the river. As I mentioned, David was an avid outdoorsman and was also very passionate about protecting and preserving the wilderness. Judy described her husband as fanatical with keeping the wilderness pristine. So dropping their lumber into the creek, this is not something David would have ever done. And again, she told police that her husband would never jump into a river in the dead of night. David Chase is still missing, and Matt's story is not adding up. And this is where the case stood still, day after day, no news, and no sign of David. Search efforts were hindered because of high waters and heavy rains for over a month. There was nothing, not a trace of David, until 6 weeks later, when a caretaker of the Gates property along the Bear Creek River reported seeing a decomposing body in the creek among some low trees. This area was 3 miles downstream from where David was last reportedly seen at the bar. Authorities arrived and confirmed their suspicions. This was the body of David Chase. The autopsy report stated the cause of death was consistent with drowning. But it wasn't so simple as that, as the coroner also noted something very strange, stating that David's neck had been broken, his pants were missing, although his shoes were still on, and the evidence showed that his clothes had been ripped from his body. Even more alarming, there were these odd cuts all over his legs. Judy Chase looked at the autopsy report and immediately noticed there were quite a few inconsistencies. One being that David was not intoxicated at the time of his death. This does not match up with Matt's account of them drinking all day long, beer after beer. Matt really emphasized this to police and alluded that David was intoxicated and therefore that's why he would go for a swim in the river. But that isn't what the autopsy reflects at all. Also, what happened to his clothes? Judy stated that her husband tucked his jeans tightly into his socks and shoes every day, as a precaution for ticks and other issues in his line of work. So what happened to his pants? Were they cut off? It did not make sense that his shoes would still be on, but his jeans would have been torn off. Judy was incredibly suspicious, and grew even more so when Matt's girlfriend again called her up and told her that she found $800 in cash in Matt's glove compartment. She had no idea where this unaccounted money came from, so police questioned Matt again. This time, they find out that Matt's story has changed. He now states that the two left the bar together, then drove down the road to dump the brush into the river. Matt then says that David didn't jump into the river willingly like he said, that actually, when the two were dumping the brush, David had an accident and fell in. So Matt's story has completely switched up now 3 times. First, he told Judy that when he left David that night, he was still playing pool at the bar. Then the story changed to David jumping into the river willingly to go for a swim after the bars and floating away. Now there's this alleged accident where David fell into the river as they were unloading brush. These ever-changing stories are throwing everyone off. And if the latter is true, why didn't Matt get help for David when he accidentally fell in? This area of the river was merely 50 feet from the town's fire station. and also yards from people meandering outside the bars. So if there was some kind of accident, Matt could have easily gotten help immediately, as there were numerous people around. But he didn't. Not only did he not seek help, he seemed to just drive off and go home for the night, leaving his friend in the river. Judy also tells police about the $800 in cash in Matt's glove compartment in his car, stating that this could be evidence from her husband's death. And not just that, this could be motive. We know the day of his disappearance, David was depositing a check for nearly $2,000. Could there have been some kind of disagreement over money between David and Matt? Authorities are very suspicious of Matt for numerous reasons. But sadly for Judy, even though they had recovered David's body in such a suspicious state, police did not move forward with any charges against Matt Orosky. The case went cold. There was no justice for David, Judy, or their family. And Matt walked free. Police said they just didn't have the evidence to charge Matt with anything. Every day, the case grew colder. But in the unseen, there was someone who wanted justice. Someone wanted the truth to be revealed. David Chase himself. A supernatural twist that no one saw coming. This case was about to go from a suspicious death into a full-blown paranormal investigation. How? Enter Phil Harris, a private investigator from Colorado. Phil had no relation to David or Judy Chase, didn't even know who David was, but he was about to get to know him quite well. On October 15, 1995, months after David's untimely death, Phil Harris had spent the evening at home with his wife. He'd fallen asleep for a couple hours on his easy chair when something unexpectedly bizarre happened. He was awakened to the sound of a disembodied male's voice. This voice said, quote, "My name is David Chase. I was murdered. I want you to investigate my murder. Go buy the Sunday paper," end quote. David was reaching out from beyond the grave to help solve his murder. This is a mystery like no other. True crime meets the paranormal. Phil sat up immediately, racking his brain around what he had just heard and experienced. He immediately went out, bought that Sunday paper, and found that article on David Chase's suspicious death. He started investigating into the details surrounding the case. Who was David Chase? What happened? And why was he reaching out to him for help? Phil eventually confided in his wife Janet, telling her about what he had heard, and told her that he knew he was chosen to help solve David's murder. He felt that David's spirit contacted him personally and for good reason, and he was going to do everything he could to help. According to Phil, David's spirit continued contacting him from beyond, providing Phil with more and more information that could crack his case wide open. David's messages came to Phil through his own voice, as well as a series of photos of what happened the night he was murdered. Receiving message after message, Phil Harris knew he needed to do something with this, so Phil picked up the phone and dialed someone who he felt needed to hear this, Judy Chase. Phil told her something along the lines of, "I know this sounds crazy and beyond belief, but I believe your husband's ghost is contacting me from beyond." As you can guess, when Judy first got the call, she was obviously very skeptical, as anyone would be. And Phil knew this and came prepared. You see, David Chase had divulged private information to Phil that only he and Judy knew. Information that was not publicly written about in the papers or known to anyone else besides David and Judy. So Phil shared some of these messages with Judy, information that only the two of them would know. In turn, Judy said, quote, "There were a lot of very personal details about my relationship with David that no one else knew, about our life together, our love for one another, pet names that David called me. He called me Honey Bunny and Shuggies, things like this. There's no way that Phil Harris could have known that," end quote. Some would say, well, maybe he just wanted in on the case. For one, it was not a high-profile case at all. It was locally known in Colorado, but that was about it, so there wasn't really a publicity angle to this. And two, to state the obvious, Phil worked as a private investigator, so if he wanted to, he could have just called up Judy and said, "I work as a PI and would love to help out with your husband's case." Phil and Judy agreed that Phil would work on David Chase's case for merely $1 until the case was solved. So, though at first Judy was skeptical, after conversations with Phil, his inside knowledge of private information, and seeing that he wasn't after any sort of payout, Judy really believed Phil. She believed that her husband's spirit was contacting him, adamant to solve his own murder. And over the coming days and months, Phil was contacted by David's spirit countless times, and David showed him through visions what happened the night he died. David Chase's spirit told Phil that Matt, alongside a younger accomplice, murdered him. Phil dutifully took a transcript of what David told him. Quote, "Before I deposited the check for $1,800, Matt talked me into cashing it and keeping the money in my pocket under the guise of possibly buying a decent truck from him. I had second thoughts about buying a truck from Matt, and I told him that as we were leaving the bar. Matt was furious with me at the time, but I didn't realize it. As soon as we got back to his truck, he started to tell me that I had promised him this money, and therefore it was his. Matt shoved me in the chest, I shoved him back, and he hit me in the face. I immediately hit him back, and all of a sudden he started bleeding very hard from the nose. This made him extremely mad, and he flew into me. I went down very near the edge of the water. In fact, we were up against the small retaining wall, fighting on the ground. We rolled around and tried to punch each other, and I feel Matt got in a couple good punches. I only remember him hitting me in the back of the neck with a hard object. I don't know what he hit me with, but it broke my neck. The knife that was used to cut my clothing off belonged to the other person. You were right, Phil, about the cuts on my legs. This is where Matt cut my clothes off, rather than take my boots off. He tied my clothes around the murder weapon. He told the kid to throw them out in the middle of the river as far as he could throw them. I'm not sure whether it was a hammer, crowbar, or even just like a gardening tool." End quote. Judy was beginning to feel like there was going to be movement in the case. With this newfound supernatural testimony, maybe Phil could lead them to answers. 1 year and 1 day after David Chase's death on June 7, 1996, Phil brought Judy to the reservoir where he believes the murder weapon and David's clothing were disposed of, pointing out exactly where David's spirit showed him it was dumped. And then, suddenly, tragedy struck again. 1 week later, Phil Harris died of a massive heart attack without being able to solve the case. Phil's family was heartbroken. This was so unexpected. Not only was Phil gone, but Judy's connection to her late husband David died along with Phil. Her supernaturally passionate and helpful ally, Phil, was now gone. So she alone went to police, giving them detail after detail of how her husband was murdered, giving them exact locations of where they can look for the murder weapon. But police didn't think much of Judy and her ghost story. Your husband's ghost contacted a PI to solve his own murder? They seemed to think it was just a crazy story. I couldn't find any information whether they even searched that reservoir, the reservoir that David Chase's spirit told Phil about, for the murder weapon either. Sergeant Scott said, quote, "If we're going to develop a criminal case, we have to have something that we could present in court. That would be a prosecutable situation. In order to do that, you have to have evidence that you can put your hands on and witnesses that you can talk to." All Judy could do at that point was wait. Wait for someone else to come forward with information, but no one did. Throughout the years, no concrete evidence has ever been provided in David's murder. Police never connected Matt to the scene. Don Olin, a homicide investigator who was assigned to David Chase's case, believes that David Chase was murdered. Don even requested an arrest warrant for Matt Orosky, charging him with criminally negligent homicide. But the DA's office declined to prosecute Matt and stated that the investigation should continue. Another devastating blow for Judy Chase and David's family. To date, no charges have ever been filed, and David Chase's murder remains unsolved. Sadly, in the years since, David's parents have both passed away. It appears that through his years as a private investigator, Phil, like so many others in that field, picked up psychic abilities. which enabled him to receive that connection from David's spirit. Another reason? Many point to the fact that Phil was unknowingly close to death himself, and perhaps that opened up a veil to the other side, allowed him to become sensitive to David's spirit, the supernatural realm. Phil died just over a year after David, and perhaps, with Phil's job as a private investigator, David chose him to come do, as he would have just the angle to help solve his case. In the end, Judy still has hope that David's case can be solved, and that someone, anyone, will come forward with information to corroborate Phil's claims. Many, myself included, wonder if David Chase's spirit will make another visit. Maybe he'll provide new information leading to the long-awaited arrest of his killers. I'm just blown away by this entire case. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. And why was it Phil, out of everyone, someone that wasn't even connected to the case? Why was he the one that got these messages? Brand new bonus episode just dropped on the Avery After Dark Patreon and memberships here on YouTube. So if you want to support the show and get bonus content, you have two choices. You can join the Avery After Dark Patreon or memberships here on YouTube. Thank you to all who have joined. New episode just dropped and I'm working on some really spooky content exclusive to Patreon and memberships here on YouTube. So I hope to see you there. Next episode, I've got so much more coming your way. Until then, check out these videos. You could pick that one. Pretty eerie. Or that one. Pretty spooky. Both great choices. Which one are you gonna pick?